Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 23, Harry Power the Bushranger. I became interested years ago in Australian bushrangers and what motivated them to go down that path. And with my family tree research that I've undertaken, it's interesting for me not only what exploits they got up to, but also their family background, to see whether there's a link between their childhood and whether they had any family out in Australia when they were being uncovered as bushrangers. And Harry Power is one of these men that did have family in Australia. He was born Henry Johnson in Waterford, Ireland on the 18th of May 1819. His family emigrated to England from Ireland during the Great Famine, and they settled in the north of England in Ashton-under-Lyne, Lancashire. Harry as a child worked as a piecer who used to tie broken threads in spinning mills, and he did this at Ashton-on-Lyne in Manchester. There is an article that mentions that his father, for many years, was a gamekeeper for the Marquess of Waterford. There is also an article where Power refers to his father, and he says, "My father was a respected, honourable man, and the old Marquis thought a lot of him. Time and again as a boy I rode some of the best of the hunters in exercise work. I was always in or about the stables, helping the men, and they trust me with any of the horses. That's where I got my riding lessons. I trained many of the hunters and was thought a great rider by the huntsmen who used to gather regularly and hunt on the estate of the Marquis. These animals took up so much of his time that he neglected school and received severe punishments from his father, much to the annoyance of his mother, who always tried to save him, as he was the youngest son and over-petted by her. His mother's misplaced kindness, though, proved in his ruination. He grew to be incorrigible. When he was 16 years of age, his father had him apprenticed to the saddlery trade, thinking it would suit him best, and that he would become a tradesman and forget the stables and the hunting field. Giving solid attention to it for a while and growing great aptitude, there seemed hope for him. But within the first year he deserted the bench and returned to the stables. The master saddler overlooked the breach of the indentures and, on the father's appeal, allowed the boy to return to work. It was clear soon after to both the saddler and the father that Harry had made up his mind not to work indoors in any trade, and a second desertion of this splendid trade in those days settled the contract. Mr. Power took no further interest in his son and left him wholly to the mother, who thought her kindness and affection would ultimately make him a good man. She had so far spoilt the lad, who's now growing up into manhood, that he refused to be advised and joined the peasants in their conflicts with the British troops. It was during this time that he received the sabre wounds on his face, which are described in the police records in Victoria as scars over the right eyebrow and scars on the right cheek. Harry had vivid recollections of these encounters and boasted that he inflicted more punishment on the soldiers than ever their swords did on him. He always managed to evade capture, and it was not his fault that he didn't take any soldiers' lives. Being an undersized boy and young man probably accounts for his escape. He was able, from his shortness of stature and activity, to do much damage and disappear from the ruck unnoticed. Now every month of his life made him the most recreant and oblivious to his parents' good offices for his welfare. The horseman's life was ingrained and was growing up with him. Abandoning school and trade work, heedless of the mother's fondness, he went headlong into any mischief likely to be profitable, caring not for the ultimate consequences. Into every riot and the worst of the fighting, which the people waged against what they honestly believed to be fully conceived and deliberate persecution by the landlords to extract tenancy dues at all hazards. He became a marked youth, and this increased his desperation. No one knew of his many violent acts and depredations. But horses were always uppermost in his mind, and he knew that if he could become possessed of the saddle and bridle, he would have small difficulty in annexing a horse at length. Illegally using a blood horse, and with this act, his career in Ireland came to an end. Power received 3 months imprisonment for vagrancy, and he later did 14 days for drunkenness. His first major offence resulted in a conviction at the age of 21 in 1841. He listed his occupation at the time of his conviction as an apprentice saddler and used the name Henry Johnson, and he used this name until he got his ticket of leave. He was tried at the Lancaster Selva General Sessions for stealing shoes, and he got 7 years transportation. The description at the time of his conviction was Roman Catholic, could not read or write, 5 foot 6.5 inches, sallow complexion, brown to grey hair, blue eyes, medium nose and mouth, large chin and a scar in his left cheek. He was placed on a prison hulk awaiting transportation. He tried to escape this hulk and received 18 lashes, and his conduct at the time was described as mutinous. After this, Power was put on board the Isabella, which sailed from England on the 8th of January 1842 and arrived at Hobart Town on the 21st of May 1842. It is said that he did not give his correct name when charged with the offence because it would have brought discredit upon the family, particularly with his father still being employed as the gamekeeper with the Marquis of Waterford. Thanks to good behaviour, Power was lucky enough to be granted a ticket of leave after only 5 years, and on November 1847 he received this, and his certificate of freedom he received in September 1848, and then he moved to the Port Phillip district. It's possible he reunited with his mother, Anne Melaniphy, in Victoria after gaining his ticket of leave. His mother arrived in Van Diemen's Land on the convict ship Mexborough in December 1841 after being convicted of stealing chickens. On the ship with her were his 3 half-sisters, Anne, Margaret and Ellen, and half-brother Patrick. In about 1850-1851, Anne and the children all went to Victoria. Once he moved on to the mainland, he now called himself Harry Power, and he was engaged in driving cattle all over Victoria and New South Wales, and he later joined Captain Denman's party in exploring and cutting a track across the ranges. In a few years, he became a splendid bushman in Australia, knowing almost every mile of the country. He then went south and became a horse dealer in Geelong, but was attracted by the gold discoveries, and during this time, it appears that he had been getting an honest living. But one incident changed his whole career. In March 1855, Harry was accosted by 2 drunken German mounted troopers at Daisy Hill near Maryborough in Victoria, who questioned him on where he got his horse. Power recalls, "I was going along quietly when down came the 2 troopers, hooting and shouting. I saw they were drunk and pulled to one side, but they stopped me. 'Whose horse is that?' says one. 'It's mine,' says I. 'I believe you stole that horse,' says the first. 'You're a liar,' says I. 'You'll have to come along with us,' says the other. 'I won't do it,' says I, getting riled. On that, one of them drew his sabre and said he'd make me. 'You can't,' says I. He charged at me, and I'd only just in time drew my revolver or he'd have cut me down. I shot him, and then the other fellow rode up and fired at me, and the powder singed my coat. I shot him and then rode off. Now, if I'd been sensible, I'd have ridden off to the nearest police station and given myself up. But I was frightened and rode across the colony, thinking to go and stay in New South Wales until the row was over. At the Murray, I was stopped. I did not deny my name or resist. They arrested me and brought me down to Melbourne. The men were not hurt much, and it was proved that they stopped me without cause, or I've got more." So a week after the incident, he was arrested while attempting to cross at Yarrawonga, and he was sentenced on the 26th of September 1855 to 13 years on the roads, despite having paperwork to prove the legitimacy of his ownership of the horse. He was sent to Williamstown, where he was imprisoned on the prison ship Success. This was one of the prison ships that were in use in Williamstown through the 1850s and 1860s due to overcrowding prisons. While doing time on the Success, Power was involved in a mutiny. The Bushranger Captain Melville led a small group of inmates to steal a towboat that took the launch boat from Success to shore on the 22nd of October 1856. During the ensuing scuffle, a man named John Turner was drowned and a constable named Owen Owens was beaten to death with a rock-breaking hammer. The convicts made it to shore but were soon recaptured. Harry, naming himself as Henry Johnston, was charged with 7 other men with 2 counts of murder. Only Melville was sentenced. After 2.5 years in the hulks, he was transferred to Pentridge Stockade. In the latter part of his sentence, Power attempted to escape from imprisonment by trying to cut a hole in the floor of the prison hospital. Naturally, he was foiled. However, Power gained his ticket of leave in 1862, headed back to Geelong, where he immediately broke the conditions of his ticket and took to the diggings. Nothing more was heard of him until June 1863, when he turned up at Middle Creek, which is between Warradji and Wodonga, and stayed with Mrs. Joanna Mackay of the Middle Creek Hotel. While there, he stole a horse belonging to the El Dorado station. He was charged on the 17th of December and he was sentenced to 12 months jail. This is when his first involvement with a young 13-year-old Ned Kelly began, but not long after they parted ways and Power chose to go solo at this time. Overall, Power liked to work alone. The law had not finished with Harry, as the horse that was stolen from Wodonga Station had turned up at Harrietville, and the trial led to Harry, who was brought before the Beechworth Court on the 19th of February 1864, and he was once again found guilty. Harry's past had also caught up with him, and the court was told of the sentence at Maryborough and that he was a ticket of leave holder at large. Harry was sentenced to 7 years on the roads and was sent to Pentridge Prison, but it would not hold him for too long. In Pentridge, Harry befriended Jack Lloyd and his brother Tom from Greta in northeast Victoria. They were the uncles of Ned Kelly and were serving a 5-year sentence each for cattle stealing. He was prone to visits to the prison hospital due to a bowel stricture that could cause bouts of extreme discomfort and render him useless for labour for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. On February 16, 1869, aged 50, after serving 6 years, Harry absconded from a bridge building gang. Having been assigned to a party clearing land by Mary Creek, Harry made sure that he was on light duties due to his health. Entrusted with taking the refuse to the mullock heap, Power hid in a divot under the heap, and when muster was called, he slipped through a gap in the wall. He acquired clothing from a nearby farm and armed himself with a blade of old sheep shears that he turned into a weapon before stealing a horse and riding to freedom. Harry turned up in the northeast, visiting his old inmates under the alias of Harry Power, and he was also introduced to Lloyd's brother-in-laws, John and James Quinn, who owned Glenmore Station on the Upper King River near Whitfield. Because of its remoteness, Harry set up a permanent camp, now known as Power's Lookout. He richly rewarded the brothers for harbouring him. He gradually expanded his network of sympathisers. Power knew that he would have to keep his sympathisers on his side and began a career of highway robbery in order to fund his supporters. Power committed highway robbery under arms from Thomas at the Buckland Road on the 7th of May 1869. Thomas Oliver Thomas was a storekeeper residing at Wangaratta, and he stated that he was on the Buckland Road travelling on horseback to Hooper's Crossing. He was riding one horse and leading another, and when within about 7 yards of him observed that the prisoner had him covered with a double-barrelled gun. The prisoner called out for the witness to stop. The witness was on the point of going when the prisoner called out, "If you go, I'll fire." The witness then came towards the prisoner, who told him to not come too near and said that his gun could kill at 300 yards. The prisoner then asked the witness what money he had. He told him first that he had none, but then he told him afterwards he had a couple of notes. The prisoner said to hand them to him, which the witness did. The witness then asked the prisoner to give him one of the pounds back, as he had taken all his money. The prisoner said he would not, as he had just stuck up the coach and got nothing. He further told the witness to consider himself lucky that he did not take his hat and coat from him. Harry Power then undertook highway robbery at the Buckland Gap again on the 28th of August 1869, so a matter of 4 months later. Edward Cody stated he was driving the Buckland coach between Beechworth and Bright, and when going down to the gap, the witness observed some logs on the road. He put his foot on the brake to stop the coach and pulled up when he saw the prisoner standing on the bank about 5 or 6 yards distant with a gun presented. The prisoner said that he thought he had seen the witness before and asked whether there were any constables on board, whether he had any firearms and how many passengers there were. He told him that there were no constables or firearms and 3 passengers besides the boy. Mr. Hazelton, a passenger, turned out his pockets and produced some silver and a watch at the prisoner's direction. The prisoner told Mr. Hazelton to put his money and watch on the ground, and he did so. The prisoner told Hazelton to stand back and came forward and took up the money and watch. The prisoner then told the witness to turn out whatever money he had. He gave him a pocketbook and a purse in which there was £2, 13 shillings and 6 pence and a 3-penny piece. The latter coin the prisoner gave to the little boy in the coach. After emptying the purse, the prisoner returned the pocketbook containing some papers to the witness. The prisoner told the ladies to turn out. Both came out of the coach, and one of them, Mrs. Lee Goo, handed her purse to the prisoner. He opened it, took out the money, which amounted to 13 shillings. She told the prisoner that was all the money she had and asked him for a shilling back to get a cup of coffee on the road. The prisoner returned her shilling. Miss Hart told the prisoner she had no money, and he took no further notice of her. At this time, another young lady, Mrs. Boyd he believed was her name, came down the gap on horseback. The prisoner told her to bail up and asked her whether she had any money, and she replied she had not. The prisoner said he did not know how it was that young ladies could ride round the country with horses and side saddles and yet had no money in their pockets. The prisoner then said he would take the horse and saddle from her. Mrs. Boyd asked him if he would allow her to go back to her father's on top of the gap, and she would give him anything he wanted. The prisoner told her he would not, but if she gave him £5, he would give her the horse. Mrs. Boyd replied she had no money. The prisoner said if she chose to borrow the money from the other ladies in the coach, he knew that the tall one had money. He would not ask where she got it, but would give her back the horse. The prisoner said that he had good mind to shoot the witness. He inquired what for, and the prisoner replied for speaking disrespectfully of him in Fisher's Bar. The witness replied that he said nothing further than that if he met Power at a shanty or a public house, he would shout for him. The prisoner stopped close to the coach and purchased a knife from the little boy. He gave the boy a shilling for the knife, and the little boy offered him back the shilling if the prisoner would give his sister, Mrs. Boyd, her horse. The prisoner smiled at this, and the prisoner told the witness to turn out some of the mail bags, which was done. Mr. Hazelton told him that the bags would be no use to him, as no money went that way, it all went by escort. The prisoner returned the bags. A man on foot at that time coming up the gap, and on his approach the prisoner told him to bail up and deliver up his money. The prisoner told the man to turn out his trouser pockets, which was done, but there was no money in them. The witness had his foot on the brake all the time and asked the prisoner to allow him to take the coach further down the gap. The prisoner gave him permission to do so. A Chinaman coming along was then stopped. Then 2 drays were noticed proceeding towards where they were standing. Power told all who were standing around to keep still or he would shoot them. When the drays, with which were 2 men, came near, the prisoner ordered them to stop and deliver up their money. A man with a spring cart then came forward, and he was likewise stopped by the prisoner and told to give up his money. This man said that he was very poor and he had not much money. The prisoner told him to get out of the cart, put his money on the ground and stand back. This was done. The prisoner then came forward and took up the money. The prisoner said to the witness that he must have one of his horses. He took a saddle and bridle from one of the drays that came down the gap. The prisoner said that he must have the snip horse, the offside wheeler from the coach, and told some of the men who were standing about to unharness the horse and saddle it for him. One of them led the horse to the prisoner after it was saddled. The prisoner led the horse about 40 yards further off. He tried to get on the horse with the gun in his hand, but the horse would not allow him to get near it. The witness thought that the prisoner then laid down the gun and tried to mount the horse, but could not. The prisoner then said he would take the brown horse, one of the leaders. The horse was unharnessed and saddled and led away by the prisoner. He got on this horse and rode back to where the coach was and told those assembled that they could start. Before starting, the prisoner gave Mrs. Boyd her horse, saddle and bridle. That was the last that the witness saw of the prisoner. The coach was stopped about 3 hours. He continued to base himself at Middle Creek, and from February 1870, Power re-emerged with a vengeance, robbing everyone from stockmen to police officers. In 1 year, he carried out 600 robberies, holding up travellers on the coach road from Mansfield, Victoria to Jamison, a small town at the junction of the Goulburn River and Jamison River, terrorising men and charming the ladies. He robbed shanties and farms. He was unafraid to use violence on occasion, but this proved to be too much work for too little reward. Far from a charming highwayman, Power's demeanour was coarse and belligerent, and it won him no sympathy from his victims. This sudden spate of robberies led to a big manhunt and much consternation around the colony. Power was believed to be cohabiting with a woman near Benalla at the time, but nobody could find him. After the initial string of robberies, Harry Power and Ned Kelly then reunited briefly. It was likely Ned, in a bid to get some money for his mother, who was behind in her rent, had begged Power for another chance. Ned described how much he had been frightened of Power. Alan Kelly despised Power, calling him a brown paper bushranger, but he had taught Ned Kelly how to survive and elude the police. In March 1870, Kelly and Power robbed Robert McBean, a well-respected magistrate, at Calera Station. They robbed him of his watch, wallet, horse and riding gear, and the duo travelled as far as Geelong, where Power checked out his old haunts with Ned by his side. McBean got word via John Lloyd that he wanted his watch back. My response was to ask for £15. When Ned was found trying to open the gates at the Moyu Pound to release impounded stock, the pound keeper threw him out of the saddle and thrashed him. This resulted in Harry and Ned later bailing the pound keeper up. Ned threatened to shoot the pound keeper on the spot, but Power gave him 3 months to get his affairs in order before he'd be shot. Shortly afterwards, Ned was arrested at home for assisting Power. During the interrogation, Kelly described Power as irascible and with a violent temper. He also described a hollow tree that Power used at his lookout point that he called his watch box, and his habit of seeing a doctor about his stricture. Ned was bounced around the courts, but various charges never stuck, and Ned Kelly was soon released. In July 1870, Power was camped at Mount Battery Station. Dr. J.P. Rowe, the lessee, got close enough to Power and Ned Kelly and fired upon them. The owner of the station described how he snuck up on the pair and fired at them, causing young Kelly to momentarily freeze in terror before they mounted and escaped. Power seems to have discarded Kelly from his service after that time, calling him a coward. He then courted others as assistants before opting to simply get on with bushranging solo, including conducting a robbery at Kyneton. Power at this time still remained friends with Ned Kelly's extended family, the Quinns. However, by the time of the falling out with Ned, the media at the time blamed Power for corrupting the young Kelly. In the Benalla Ensign in 1870, it says, "The effect of his example has already been to draw one young fellow into the open vortex of crime, and unless his career is speedily cut short, young Kelly will blossom into a declared enemy of society." So they very much foretold the future there. What set Power apart from other bushrangers was that he was apparently a gentleman. He was very rarely violent. He never killed his victims, nor the police that hunted him down. Word got around that he was quite a pleasant chap, with local ladies telling police that he'd flatter them and telling them they were beautiful, even as he was robbing them. Power had quickly become the biggest thorn in the side of the Victoria Police, and a £200 reward was offered for his capture. Power ventured into New South Wales at this time and committed a series of robberies around the Riverina, and it seems for all intents and purposes that Power was untouchable. By the end of 1869, Power had vanished. There were no reports, no sightings or leads, and it rendered police pursuits ineffective. Power was described as probably English, aged 40 or 50, 5'6" or 7", with short greying beard, heavy eyebrows, wearing a light grey sack coat of raised pattern, light trousers, light brown felt hat and blucher boots. And blucher boots were characterised by their open lacing. He was not only an excellent bushman and horseman, but he was a great showman who boasted about his exploits, and he liked to sing. One song he had was, "We might sing of young Gilbert, Dan Morgan, Ben Hall, but the bold, reckless robber surpasses them all. The pluck that's in Power is past all belief, daring highwayman, professional thief." Although he never committed a murder and very seldom took money from the poor, he possessed an extremely violent temper. Harry felt safe in his gunya above the Quinns homestead in his hideout because he had several dogs and a noisy peacock who would notify them of any rangers in the area. Unfortunately, Power was not invincible, and his health made for a difficult time in the bush. His bowel stricture and bunions resulted in frequent clandestine visits to doctors. To alleviate the pain in his feet, he would wear boots so oversized they curled at the toes. The fact that he was well into middle age wouldn't have helped much either. Details of a confrontation between Harry Power and a police constable at King Parrot, or now known as Strath Creek, was hot news in 1870 in the Alexandra Times newspaper. They wrote, "Power the Bushranger has been kicking up a wonderful hubbub amongst us for the last few days," wrote the Times Yea correspondent in the 4th of March issue. On Sunday last, the excitement was intense. A messenger arrived in the township about noon in great haste from Doyle's at King Parrot with the news that the Bushranger and a constable had each bailed up behind trees close to Doyle's house and were exchanging shots, and that Doyle had Power's horse locked up in his stable. A mounted constable on his way from Broadford to Yea led 2 horses. When about a quarter of a mile on the Yea side of Doyle's, he was pounced upon by the Bushranger, who covered him with his double-barrelled gun and demanded the constable throw down his arms, which demand he at once acceded to without any attempt to resist. After possessing himself of the constable's revolver, he ordered him to return the same way he had come, which order was at once obeyed by the unfortunate policeman. The next person that came this way was Mr. F. Mackenzie, Sheep Inspector, on his way down from Warrigawan to Kilmore. This gentleman was also ordered to stop, and the Bushranger, fancying his horse better than his own, took possession of it, but kindly offered his own in exchange, which offer Mr. Mackenzie declined. Power then immediately made off and has not been since heard of, although police are scouring the country in all directions. He stuck up several wagoners near Avenel, and he took about £30. His main object in sticking up King Parrot seems to have been to provide himself with a fresh horse, as he did not subject Mr. Mackenzie to an examination or molest him in any other way than taking his horse. It is strange that he did not take one of the government horses from the constable, as they were far superior animals to the one he took from Mr. Mackenzie. His objection to them must have been on an account of the Crown brand. So much for Mr. Power, who is certainly leading the police on a merry dance again. Superintendents Nicholson and Hare and First Class Sergeant Montford arrived at Benalla on the 29th of May 1870, having been sent on special duty in connection for a search for the Bushranger Power. They proceeded to a station and were engaged several days in prosecuting inquiries. On the 1st of June they proceeded, accompanied by a black tracker and a guide, whose services they had secured, to head to the King River. They reached Tabletop Range and camped there, turning out their horses. They carefully avoided all roads and tracks while travelling through the bush. At daybreak, they proceeded through the mountains till they reached a spot within 14 miles of the Glenmore Range. They camped in a secluded gully and remained prosecuting their inquiries until the afternoon of the 4th of June. During this time, they were compelled to watch their horses so as to guard against being discovered by any persons. At 5:30 p.m. on the Saturday, they started on horseback, proceeding a mile or two when the darkness became so dense the guide declined to go any further, stating that he'd lost his way and the ranges were so steep that he feared an accident. He suggested that the party wait till daybreak, having evidently miscalculated his knowledge of the natural features of the country. He was, however, prevailed upon to proceed, and with the assistance of Sergeant Montford, whose previous knowledge of the country was here found to be invaluable, a track was discovered which led to the part of the King River which they desired to reach. The King River being on one side and several deep and dangerous lagoons on the other. These lagoons terminate in a creek, the only bridge over which is exactly opposite Quinn's premises. There was reason to believe that Power's usual camping place was not far from Quinn's house. At midnight the party made a start, and after going for half a mile and crossing numerous watercourses, which they were compelled to wade into to ascertain their depth, the guide was once more at a loss, and the party found themselves in a labyrinth of lagoons from which it appeared almost impossible to extricate themselves. However, by the assistance of the black tracker, they succeeded in retracing their steps to the place from which they'd started 4 hours before. The darkness at this time was so great that it was with the utmost difficulty the party was kept together, and the horses at last refused to face the creeks. The night was drawing to an end. They proceeded in haste in the direction of Queen's House, but keeping on this occasion along the banks of the river, encountering by the way many obstacles such as log fences and dead timber, till they reached a paddock a quarter of a mile from the house. The party here dismounted, and leaving the horses in the care of the black tracker, they crept cautiously along the lagoon at the back of Queen's House. For the third time the guide stated he was quite incapable of leading the party to the point they wished to reach, and appeared to be suffering from extreme fatigue and cold. By this time it was broad daylight. They made a fresh start, spreading out in a line and systematically searching spurs and gullies. At 7:30 a.m, when about half a mile up Glenmore Range, they came upon a hollow tree, which had been used as a sleeping place, and which led them to the conjecture that they were on the right track. At that instant, the black tracker saw smoke 300 yards further up the mountain. They proceeded silently and speedily in that direction, and when within about 30 yards of the smoke, they perceived a fire in front of a quantity of gum bushes which screened a gunya. This the party immediately rushed on, discovering inside the bushranger Power, lying with his clothes on, his revolver by his side and a gun close to his head. The party covered him with their revolvers and called on him to surrender, dragging him outside and handcuffing him without his making any further resistance. To the remark made that he had given the police a great deal of trouble, he replied, "I am sorry, I did not hear you coming. I would have dropped one of you," and added that he would have preferred being shot dead to be taken alive. Sergeant Montfort was then dispatched for the horses. On searching the gunya, the party discovered a large supply of bread, meat, tea, sugar and vegetables. The revolver and double-barrelled gun were both heavily loaded. In the gunya they found a purse containing £15. Having taken possession of all the property found in the gunya, they placed Power on the black tracker's horse and rode off to a hut 9 miles distant, where they obtained a cart and reached Wangaratta, 40 miles away, at 7 p.m. on the Sunday night, after being 25 consecutive hours in the saddle. The prisoner was most communicative as to his exploits. He complained of the many persons who reported to have been robbed by him, for which statements he said were not of the slightest foundation. He admitted having committed numerous robberies and stated his intention to plead guilty to those brought against him. During the whole time, the hardships the party underwent were considerable. With the exception of Thursday, it rained incessantly, and the difficulties were considered enhanced by the caution they had to observe, which necessitated the adoption of the most difficult and secluded routes. They had only taken provisions sufficient for 2 meals per man, and were unable to obtain further supplies, and were moreover without any kind of shelter for the whole period, while the idea of lighting a fire was of course out of the question. Their success was in great measure owing to the thorough knowledge of the country which Sergeant Montfort possessed, he having formerly been stationed at Wangaratta for some time. Power was sentenced at Beechworth to 15 years hard labour on 3 counts of bushranging. He was convinced it was Ned Kelly that had dobbed him in, but this wasn't the case. While in jail, he became somewhat of a celebrity, being interviewed for a newspaper feature called the Vagabond Papers, where he opened up about his life of roguery. He did not live quietly, frequently getting himself into trouble for smoking in jail and being where he wasn't meant to be, and generally getting into mischief. In the interview, he recounted, "Once when they were after me, I was going through the ranges a little off the track when I saw old Judge A. Beckett riding along the road on circuit. I followed him most of the afternoon, waiting for a chance. I didn't want to kill him, for I'd never killed anyone except in self-defence. My notion was to lift his purse, and so on, and splice him to a fence, and so keep him late for the assizes. So intent, however, was he on watching the judge, he neglected to keep an eye on his own safety. Then it came about that he himself was captured by a party of police and others who were following the judge at some distance. That night, Judge A. Beckett, bearing that Power was in the jail and knowing the bushranger well, visited him in his cell. The judge was much amused when the bushranger told him how near he had come to being the unwilling subject of highway robbery. I knew I was safe in telling him, for I knew he was a good fellow, a straight honest man, and wouldn't use it against me. But his eye twinkled when he came to sum up in my case. No one but himself and me knew what I was after when they got me, and no one knew why the judge smiled at me from the bench, but he only gave me my proper stretch for horse stealing. Yes, Judge A. Beckett was a decent fellow. Harry Power was a bushranger of great confidence and flair. He was known for his sense of humour when he conducted his crimes. On one occasion, he was confronted by 3 armed young men who told him that they were hunting for the bushranger Power. He begged them for protection and pretended to go along with them. When the opportunity presented itself, he robbed them of their guns, their clothes and boots, leaving them to find their way home through the bush completely naked. At this time, the government decided to sell the Hulk success, and it was converted to a floating museum, and old Harry being employed as the main attraction. One of the most surprising things about old Harry was the fact that his mother was transported to Van Diemen's Land only 6 months after he was. When Harry moved to Victoria, the family followed, and the authorities never knew of the family connection until one of them, Margaret Slater, penned a letter on the 14th of March 1877 trying to get Harry released from jail into her care. Many of Harry's movements were a direct consequence of keeping in touch with his family, and he continued to do this right up until his death. He was chief cook at Pentridge. A good cook he was, they say, thrifty as a Chinaman and clean as a Scotch housewife. He was released from jail on the 9th of February 1885 when he was 66, and he went to live with his half-sister at Brighton. After accounts of Power's ill health, he was released based on the application of several women, including Lady Janet Clark, wife of Sir William Clark, who gave Power work on the Clark property as a gamekeeper for the next 10 years in peace. He was released into a world that had left him behind. The Kelly gang had come and gone. The towns were becoming rapidly urbanised with trains and other modern conveniences. And in an interview, Harry Power said, "Since I've been out, though, I've got on pretty well. Big Clark is very kind to me. He wants me to live on one of his stations for the rest of my life. But I prefer to knock about a bit. Sometimes I stay a while at one of his places. Sometimes I go to see my sister. I have an adventure now and again. Last time I went to see my sister, I found some surveyors at work on her place, and I asked her what they were doing there. She said they were surveying it because someone had made a claim to the land. My blood was up, and I wasn't going to see my sister and her children done out of their bit of land. So I took my gun and rode out after those surveyors. I came on them and ordered them to clear out. They said they didn't take orders from old Swagman. Then, by God, says I, you'll take orders from me. I'm Harry Power, the bushranger, who always kept his word. And I give you my word now that if you ain't on your horses and away inside 2 minutes, I'll shoot you in your tracks." Lord, it was fun to see them. They dropped their fixings and ran to their horses. Just to frighten them thoroughly, I rode after them for about 10 miles. Their fixings are at my sister's now. They never called back for them, and I don't think they will so long as they know I'm alive. On Saturday, October the 10th, 1891, Harry arrived at Swan Hill by train. He visited his nephew and most likely his half-sister that was living out towards Ultima. He stayed at the White Swan Hotel, but made no mention of why he was really there and apparently booked under an alias. He was last seen alive on Monday, October the 12th, when he purchased a bottle of English ale. The following Sunday, 18th of October, the steamer Rothbury found a body floating in the Murray River 10 miles downstream from Swan Hill, presumed from drowning. There is nothing to show how he came into the river. The body was decomposed. All they knew was it was an old man, and the face had been eaten away by Murray crayfish, so he was actually identified by the clothes he wore and only had a few shillings in his pockets. Following an inquest, he was buried in a pauper's grave, his identity at that point unknown, but a report forwarded to the Chief Commissioner resulted in the authorities forming the consensus that the once notorious bushranger Harry Power was the man that they found in the river. There is a report in a newspaper article stating that they were awaiting on further investigations by contacting Harry's sister Margaret Slater in the Melbourne suburb of Oakley. Family members that have stated that when he died, his body was identified by his clothing, particularly a red scarf that was knitted for him by his niece, Sarah Slater, so his half-sister, Margaret's daughter. So this is what gave the police that definitive answer that it was indeed Harry Power the Bushranger's body. There is a theory that this was not Harry, that the authorities just felt that that was an easy way of relieving the public's concern. In 1896, there was an article that appeared in a London newspaper, and it was republished in a Sydney Evening Supplement newspaper in that same year. And there was a man that was chatting to a person on Blackwall Pier in England and claimed that he was Harry Power. The elderly man gave a lot of details. I'll leave that up for you to judge. There is a Facebook page titled Harry Power Bushranger that has a full account of what that old man's told that man on that day at the pier in England. It's quite interesting reading. Harry's convict record is quite extensive, and there are several pictures of him at different stages of his life that I'll put on the Facebook page. In closing with this episode, quote from Harry Power: "Yes, I've been a bad man, and I am sorry for my sins, but here on my dying bed I can swear no woman was ever worse for me." There is a bonus episode attached to this story. Harry's family, his mother, his 3 half-sisters, and his brother that were transported, as well as a couple of other family members I uncovered, and their links and descendants in Australia.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes